Do you know who I am? I'm kind of a big deal.
Welcome again to another edition of Overtime with Dr. Michael Jacobs, and I'm Chip Franklin. You're a physician, and it's interesting to listen to you talk about your take on the game, because as you're speaking, I noticed that there's a real psychological aspect to this, even though we're talking about injuries. Obviously, mental toughness, we hear that word all the time. How often do major league teams take this into account? And do they ever bring in like psychologists to work with you and the players together?
All the teams have psychologists or psychologist-like people. It's become much more intense in the analytics age, where I think it's part of their program. They think they can sometimes do more than I think they can do of building this up. But nonetheless, we've always had it. From time since I've been there's always been the EAP for the people who have some addiction problems, or the people who need some of the drugs for hyperactivity. And there's always been a psychologist, or we have always had two psychiatrists who worked with it. Now they tend to call them performance people. And there's all complete training programs in college to train performance people who are kind of hybrid psychologists, social workers, psychiatrists. And I think if you remember with the problem out in Seattle a couple of years ago, where one of those people got crosswise with the baseball people and was fired. But they are very important. You can't not recognize that there's an emotional and mental aspect to this. My take on it is completely different than what the present world is like. I notice it with my daughter-in-law and my young children. They're internet-born babies. So to them, everything's on the internet. Every time the baby burps, they go to the doctor. I mean, my kids went to the doctor. 3 boys maybe went 4 times in 30 years. She must have been there 40 times. And they think you need a specialist for everybody. A lot of kids in 3rd grade are going to counseling. And I'm trying to figure out why 3rd graders need counseling. And I think it's different because, to me, performance, psychological boosting, for most people, it is distilled into one word, and that's confidence.
Yeah.
And you can't say force confidence. You can't say, Chip, I want you to like me and make you like me. I can't say, Chip, you've got to be confident. And I always felt that the performance people should work with the coaches. And it's the coach's job to instill in the player a structure that makes them be confident. I don't know Tiger Woods. I've certainly never met him. But you have seen through his career, he's supremely confident. And he will talk about how he started around poorly and realized he had a mechanical problem and he made adjustments. That's somebody who knows how to deconstruct their golf game if it's not right, and bring it back and deal with it. Mike Mussina, who is a savant at baseball, it was quiet, but I would talk to him a fair amount. He would say some days he'd look at his velocity, he'd look at his pitch repertoire and say, I got to jump this pitch today. I got to work with that pitch. And Mike was a savant, Palmer's a savant, but I think if coaches can instill players that, it's still hard for me to figure how somebody who's never played can teach somebody to feel confident about hitting or pitching.
And it's interesting, too, when you look at like Jackson Holiday, for example, slow start and so much expectations on a young, he was 20 years old at the time. It's amazing that a 20-year-old kid can go out there and find it. And it appears like he has. He's begun to adapt to what is a totally different experience than AAA. And I wonder, what does a coach say to a kid or any person that's trying? It goes for an 0 for 30. And obviously an 0 for 30 is mental. It's not all physical, right? Because sometimes you see a guy breaking 0 for 30 and then he goes 11 for 15 or something like that. The psychological part of the game, there was a book called The Head Game, which was about pitching. And it said that probably the best pitch ever created in Major League Baseball was the changeup, right? Because you got a lot of guys that could throw hard, but could you throw it soft for a strike in a place the guy couldn't hit it? And it does come to my mind that, you deal with people that get injured and you're trying to help them get well. How much of that is psychological to get well? I mean, to go through all the stuff you have to do to get back to where you were.
Well, a couple things. Number one, Holiday is a special case because his father was an elite ball player. I'm sure he grew up in a positive environment.
Oh, we had him
And
on a show. We had Matt on, and you could tell that this guy was a dedicated dad, a decent guy, and it was really fun to listen to him talk about his sons. But go ahead.
so I think he had unusual support to go with his talent. Of course, go back 50, 70 years, okay? Willie Mays started like one for a zillion, okay?
So
And
to
what
Cal,
happened? There was no psychology counseling except Leo DeRocher. And what did Leo say to him? He said, "You're my center fielder, kid. Don't worry about it.
how
Okay.
big is that?
I'm
How
not
big is
yanking you. I'm not yanking you. You can catch the ball pretty good. You're my center fielder." Okay.
hold on, let me interrupt you. Didn't they tell Jackson this year? Didn't the wasn't he told that after Hyde was fired that look, you're my second baseman against lefties and righties? That's got to make him feel confident too, right?
Well, they don't have a choice. They traded everybody else away.
What Westberg's coming back in Urias, you got to move people around. I mean,
They traded everybody. When they traded, what's his name, the Marlins, they were out infielders.
right.
But and Mickey Mantle, there's famous stories of his dad gave him the tough love. You know, he wanted to go back home to Oklahoma. He
Yeah.
started terribly, and obviously trying to fill Joe DiMaggio's shoes is a whole nother world. But obviously Casey said to him, "You're my center fielder." So that's to me the way you do this is you work that way. And sometimes it's just reality. I mean, I've had pitchers, veteran pitchers, who've had surgery and come back, and I've heard them say, "I'm just done." You know, sometimes they know they've lost it, and sometimes it's just real. I mean, as pitchers like to say, and Palmer likes to say, the hitters will tell you if you got anything. And so I think that toughness isn't really an issue. Hopefully, in today's world, I think most players rehab hard between their agents and their rehab programs. And the docs are so good, you know, probably 90% of the elbows are done by Keith Meister, who has his own program, his own book, his own people. So I think the rehab programs are great.
And
I just think
but the thing about rehab, Doc, and people they've never been injured, don't know, rehab is excruciatingly painful on a couple levels. One is that, you know, it hurts. You know, you got to, you're using something and whatever reason why there's still inflammation in there and trying to get that. The second part is you wonder, am I ever going to get better again? And that, you know, that depression, that ups and downs, right? I mean, it can't be easy. And I would imagine that in some ways to these guys, you are a psychologist. You're trying to get them mentally ready for what's coming ahead. Was that any part of your medical training?
not what I trained in the 70s, but it's just common sense.
Yeah.
And that's why it's the same problem with the baseball team of having nobody with experience. You know, we don't have a hitting coach who can say, "Hey, kid, I've gone 0 for 30. You'll get out of it." You just got a bunch of people who never played. I mean, as a surgeon who's done a lot of surgery, the surgeon can say, "Look, I've done it 700 times. It starts slow. You'll get there." I've been playing the piano for 60 years. I did a concert at Bowdoin. When we did a little 50-year reunion concert. And I remember I pulled out a piece I played 50 years ago. And I started and I said, "Can I really get this back up to speed?" I mean, I just grinded at that piano for 3 months trying to get that piece back up to speed. I would listen to recordings, even of myself, and go, "Oh, I'm never going to get there, but I just got to keep grinding at it." And I think most of the ball players today, between the money, their agents, their families, I think they got the grinding part. It's just a matter of making a ball spin and dance. It's usually hitters. It's just hard. You know, I used to say, you know, when Cal's back was bothering him, he wasn't playing quite as well as he used to, but he was still a serviceable player. I used to say if Cal loses 10% of his skills, he's still a player on the field. If a pitcher loses 10% of his fastball, he's worthless. You know, getting back to the pitching apex just requires special coaching to make adjustments that not everybody does have the mental outlook to do. And coaches, psychologists, performance people can help, but it still comes from within.
You know, on that note, last question. I mean, last comment on that. Bob Gibson, a lot of people didn't realize this, that he was nearsighted. And so some of the times when McCarver was giving him a signal, he'd squint, and the players thought he was trying to make them intimidate him. And he said, I wasn't trying to intimidate anybody. I mean, I would throw inside, but I just was squinting. And of course, that famous story of it, the last pitch he threw in the major leagues was a grand slam home run, I think to a guy named Adcock, if I recall. And then 10, 12 years later, he was in Old Timers game and he faced Adcock. And what did he do? He hit him.
Well, I've heard Costas tell that story a million times.
It's a great story.
I don't believe it for a second.
I know, right?
Bob Gibson, of course, fell off the mound and hurt, chewed up his knee. And I could tell you a Don Buford story. Of course, Bob Gibson didn't give an inch, okay? And back in the 60s when Buford was a young, and if you know Don, he's short, but he played fullback or halfback either at USC or UCLA. He's not a small man. He's kind of a short man, but he was a speed guy. And he was trying to make the White Sox as a young African-American kid when the civil rights was starting to explode. Gibson was already a star. They were playing a spring training game in Al Lang Field, okay? And Buford tried to bunt for a hit, and Gibson hit him the next time. And then he looked at him and he said, I don't allow bunting, kid, okay? Just like that. I don't allow bunting, okay? So, and Bill White said, who was his teammate for a million years, when he went to the Phillies, in a key situation, Gibson knocked him down when he was jawing at him from first base. Gibson said, you're not on my team anymore, guy. So I don't believe for a second that scowl wasn't real, okay? I'm not buying that.
All major sports have the head component to it. And sometime in the future, we should tell more stories because there's some incredible stories about guys that once they wrap their head around it, their performance increased greatly. And it's interesting to see now in professional sports, catchers don't get to call the games. You got outfielders pulling little cards out of their back pockets and just come on, let them play anyway. That's Dr. Michael Jacobs. I'm Chip Franklin. This is another edition of Overtime. We'll see you next week.
Do you know who I am? I'm kind of a big deal.